And welcome as we dive into our first lesson on other programming languages, because a lot of times when you go into the industry, not every language is going to be the language you learn. For example, if you are learned on Java, but the job you're using is C++, it's good to be able to know how to be versatile enough to adapt what you know into another language, such as learning the different syntax and rules of that language. And for us to start off, we're going to start off with a relatively easy one, which is that of Python. And of course, we're going to kind of take a quick cursory glance at each of these languages as we move through this. So let's first start off by looking at variables and strings in Python and how it's going to be similar and different to what we are already familiar with. So this is our first look at another language. Python, of course, is the language we're looking at, and it's a very popular programming language. It's used for many different applications such as web development, software development, has mathematical applications, system scripts, and much more. Now, Python runs on what's known as an interpreter system, meaning that the code can be executed as soon as it's written, and it also means because of that, your prototyping can actually be done very quickly. Python actually is a kind of what's more of a general purpose language. It's not necessarily an object-oriented language like Java is, but you can use it in that way if you want. So it actually can be run procedurally, object-oriented, or even just in a more functional manner. Now, when we start looking at the syntax of Python, it's going to be a little different than if what you're used to maybe with Java. Python, of course, can work on various different platforms, and its syntax is relatively simple, which allows developers to write programs with fewer lines than some other programming languages may use, as you're going to see as we start looking at here when we compare things to Java. Now, Python was designed from the start for readability, and has, in that sense, many similarities to like the English language, with some influence from mathematics. Python uses new lines to complete a command as opposed to many other programming languages such as Java, which often use things like semicolons or parentheses to indicate the end of a line. Python also is going to rely on indentation using white spacing to define the scope of things. And you're going to start seeing this, and we're going to use tab a lot here. So things such as loops, functions, and classes. So if you aren't in the habit of using your tabs properly, this is when you're going to want to make sure you start brushing up on that, because it's going to matter a lot more here in Python than it did in Java. Now, other programming languages, again, Java, are going to use things like curly brackets for the same purpose, because you use curly brackets to encapsulate things. Here, those tab levels that you're going to see are going to be the things that are going to really help separate that out. And we're also going to look at a new IDE while we're working here. We're very familiar with using Eclipse up to this point to help us write code. However, Eclipse is not the only IDE environment out there. In fact, there's a ton of them out there. Even just for Java, there's other ones you can use. However, for learning of Python, we're going to use Visual Studio Code to help us write our programs. And before we get into that, let's first take a look at how we're going to use some of that code. So I want to first touch off with commenting, because of course we got to document our code as we're going in. Much as how we comment in Java, we can do the same in other languages, for the same purposes. So for Python, we're going to use this though with a hash instead of the double slashes that we're used to. Now, Python does not have the ability to do a multi-line or block comment built in. Like Java, we can use the special symbol orientation in order to get those block comments. Python, you can't do that. Now, there is kind of a workaround. We have a little trick. We can use a multi-line string literal that isn't assigned to a variable, such as kind of what you see here. So it's just literally just a bunch of quotes there, and Python's going to see that and say, oh, that's just a string literal. It's not assigned to anything, and so it's going to ignore that. And you notice that we have 3 quotes here with 3 lines, so it's kind of helping correspond that. But again, this is not a true block comment as we're used to. This is kind of more of a workaround that we can use. Now let's actually take a look at variables, and then we're going to actually look at this in our IDE to see how we can start using some of these things. So unlike in Java, Python has no command for declaring a variable. Remember, in Java, we always say it's type name equals a value. Well, in here, you'll just see that it assigns a value upon that variable's creation. So if I have a variable named x, I set equal to 5, and that variable's ready to go. Notice it does not say like int x. It's not assigning a type to it. And you see this says name equals Johnny. Again, you don't see, like, for example, the word string in front of it. Note that variables in Python, though, they don't have that type declaration, but they are case sensitive. So if I had a variable named X and a variable named capital X, those are not the same variable. Just like if I had name lowercase and name uppercase, those would be considered two different variables. Now, if you want to specify the data type of a variable, this can be done with casting. So for example, I have x equals str3. That means that is a string type. And of course, you'll want to take note of these types here. So str is for strings. We have y, which is int, which is for integers. We have z, which is float, obviously for floats. So this would, of course, be the string value 3. This would be the integer value 3. And this is the float value 3, which means to be 3.0. Now, speaking of strings, when we actually look at how those are used in Python, they're actually kind of unique in that we can use either a single quote or a double quote to denote them. So, for example, name equals quote Johnny, or other name equals single quote John. You notice that these are both strings, but this one has double quotes, this one has single quotes. I personally prefer using the double quotes because of my background experience in using Java. But if you are more comfortable or more familiar with using single quotes, you can do that as well. Again, both ways are perfectly valid. But my personal preference is just I use the double quotes because, again, that's what I'm used to using whenever I'm using strings. Now, it doesn't do us any good to have these variables without knowing what can we do with them, right? So the very first thing we're going to do, of course, is being able to know how do we print these out to the console. Well, the command for displaying variables is easy. We just use the print function. And, this is not system.out.println like we're used to with a big long string of things. Instead, it's literally just the command print. And you can see it has an open and closed parentheses. And so if I want to print a variable, let's say x, it's just going to be print, and then I put it inside those parentheses x. You can also, of course, print literal values and strings directly. So, for example, I want to print the value 3. I can have just say print 3, and it would display the number 3. If I want to print the string hello, notice it's not assigned to a variable, I can, of course, just put that there in quotes, and it would print that out as hello. All right, so here I am inside of Visual Studio Code. You might have to set your application up in order to get it running, but the big thing is if you are in here and you haven't run a program before in here, one thing you'll have to do is come here to File, and we're going to do a new text file. And then it's going to, of course, access to select language. Now I'm going to come here, and I can either scroll down or I can start typing, and Python will pop up here. And when I click on that, you'll see that the type changes from a text file to a Python file. Additionally, you'll see down here there's a prompt that says, do you want to install the Python extension? Go ahead and install this if it comes up, because this will allow you to have that extension built in, which is really good because then we want to have that support for Python. Of course, it's just going to take it a little bit for it to install, so we'll let that go ahead and run. And that didn't take very long at all, because now here it is. And you can see it's got a couple new things here. So even when I click on Start New File, you can see it's going to go ahead and pop up. Now when I click on New File, you notice that we have a text file, but then we also have a Python file. So now I can go ahead and click Python file directly, because if I hit New File, it's going to be right here out of those lists of things. So both, of course, are ways for us to get there, but I'm just going to go ahead back to the original one I had here. Now the first thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to save this file. So we're going to go File, Save As, and then, of course, save this to our appropriate folder. And so now that that file is named, I can go ahead and now actually start doing some codes to it. So very first thing, let's go ahead and start off with the very first thing that we learned back in the day, which is, of course, the hello world function. So you can see it's giving me the print command here. So I'm just going to go ahead and do hello world just so we can go ahead and see this. Now notice there's no semicolons or anything like that here. Now that that's done, let's go ahead and run our code. And here we have our run Python file. So I'm going to go ahead and run that. And if we get this message that says no Python interpreter selected, so we're going to go ahead and select that. And it says Python is not installed, so we need to go ahead and install Python. So if you get this message, it means that you need to install Python on your PC, so let's go ahead and do that. Now if you're on a Windows PC, the Windows Store will pop up and give you a suggested version, or you can go right over to the actual Python software website and download there. That might have a newer version, but we're just going to go ahead and get the version right here for now. From the Microsoft Store, let that go ahead and install. But again, if you don't want to do this way, or if you want to install it on your own, you can do that as well. And of course, it's just going to take a second here for this to download. Once it's downloaded, we should of course be able to go ahead and use this in our program. Again, it doesn't take very long here. You can see it's zipping right along. Zoom, 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 zoom. All right, so that is done. So I'm just going to go ahead and minimize that. And if we try to run this again, and you can see it's still got that warning down here, interpreter. So now you can see when I click on that warning, you can see now it says, oh, Python 3.11. So now I can click on that. That warning's gone away. I can now run my program. And you can see it now says hello world. Awesome. So that has worked. Now let's go ahead and test this with a couple quick variables. So I'm just going to go ahead and let's just say x equals 3, y equals 7, z equals -2, and let's just have a string. Let's have name equals Smith, and let's just go ahead and print some of this stuff. So let's say I want to print x, print y, print z, and print name. All right, save that, give it a run, and you can see we get 3, 7, -2, and Smith. Now the last thing let's just show some basic things that we can also do with a variable. So let's just say we want to print, what's if I did like x plus z? Can we do addition as we would expect? How, or is that going to make that into a string? Because you notice we didn't define the types here. So if I go ahead and run this as x plus z, you notice I get 1. And that's because Python says, oh, I'm going to do x plus z, and it's going to assume that based upon what value is here, that this is probably a numeric type. All right, now let's go ahead and see what about joining a string and a number type. So let's just say I say print, and let's just do name plus y, all right? Which, of course, if I try doing this way and I run the program, notice we get an error here. All right, oh no, that doesn't work. So what do we need to do to fix it? Well, we need to typecast this. So I'm just going to go ahead and add in parentheses over here, str parentheses around the y. And let's see if that fixes that. Give it a rerun. And notice now we get Smith 7. Awesome. So that, of course, is printing that out. Now, if I wanted it to say Smithy, of course, I would have to put, of course, I'd have to put the letter Y here. But I'm not going to worry about that because, again, I wanted to put the actual literal there. So Smith 7 is there now. And so now that this is done, this gives us a nice, good introduction to some of the things that we can do in Python with our strings and with variables.